Today, I'm kind of excited to be here with a good friend of mine, a collaborator over the last 6 years or so in the world of FAIR, factor analysis of information risk. And that's Jack Jones, the author of FAIR, and some people say grandfather, but I won't do that to you.
Ouch, ouch. Okay.
So uh, we're going to do a little question and answer today. I work with a lot of folks who are using FAIR, and I use it as well, both in the first party and third party worlds. And people sometimes it can be challenging when they go from that qualitative view of a risk to a quantitative view. So maybe just get your perspective on a couple different things. All right. The first thing is when you're building a program and you've been reporting risk in colors, red, green, orange, yellow, and you move to using FAIR or FAIR-CAM to assess that risk. That shift to the reporting to your executives can be challenging. Even though you have a nice distribution and a most likely number, I sense and I get feedback from folks frequently is that people still like to focus on that one single ordinal number. How do you get people beyond that?
Well, ordinal values, 1 through 5s or, red, yellow, greens, those can be useful, right? Now, they have a lot of limitations in terms of the information they're not providing. They can be interpreted sometimes as having more precision than they do. Someone says it's 2 or 2.5 or something like that. That's looks like a precise number. And I think if you've been around risk measurement any length of time, especially quantitative measurement, precision is a pipe dream. What you're aiming for is accuracy. And in a discipline like cybersecurity, where it's dynamic and where sometimes your data isn't what you'd like it to be, then what you're aiming for is accuracy, right? And or truthfulness is another way to say it. And you do that by presenting the results in ranges rather than, discrete values like 2 or 2.5 or something like that. And so there's a matter of understanding that the difference between precision and accuracy. Precision is exactness, accuracy is truthfulness. And once you wrap your mind around that, then actually I find most people become much more comfortable with quantitative than they were previously, because they recognize they're not trying to nail it down to a number. Now, you will occasionally find executives who want a number, and that's fine. So when you have a range, say your range is 2 million to 3 million, just as an example, your loss exposure is 2 million to 3 million. Somewhere in there, you can choose a number. It might be the average, the midpoint. It might be the 90th percentile, something like that. You can pick a number within that range and report that number. But when you do, you want to also convey it as this is the average, or this is the 90th percentile, or something like that. So they get their number, but they also understand that it's drawn from a distribution or a range. So they know that there's uncertainty there. And I think that notion of uncertainty in measurement is really underappreciated. It's misunderstood, but it's also underappreciated. I feel it is a responsibility of ours to convey the level of certainty in our measurements. And if we have a high level of uncertainty, wide ranges and flat distributions and those sorts of things, That's important information to convey to decision makers because that can affect the decision they make. And it's a more truthful representation. So I think once people kind of wrap their minds around that, then the transition from colors and 1 through 5 scales and those sorts of things can become more comfortable and easier.
I use a quote and I attribute it to you, and I hope it is you, but it's the accuracy with a useful degree of precision.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
My next question, and I've seen this as well, that people get comfortable, with FAIR. They find it very useful, and I remember my transition going from numbers and colors to actually reporting in dollars. The attention you got, and now I'm speaking the same language of executives who are thinking about the bottom line. But then I see sometimes a tendency folks drift towards, well, that's all they do. They talk about the dollars and cents, but they don't really get into how it connects to risk. What would you suggest when you're doing that reporting to make sure that the whole picture is?
Well, you measure and report risk to drive decision making, awareness and decision making, and if you understand the decisions you're trying to influence, maybe it's prioritization of remediation activities, maybe it's investment decisions, maybe it's decisions around should the organization embark on some new business initiative or invest in new technologies or open new markets or whatever the case might be. If you understand the business context and can articulate loss exposure in that context, then that provides meaningfulness to the executives, and they're far more likely to listen and pay attention. So it's really understanding that business context and what initiatives or decisions or whatever the case might be, a loss event, if it occurs, would or could affect, and to what degree. So I would say that's where people need to focus. It's not about measuring it. And I was guilty in the early days of this, of focusing on measurement, just being enthralled with the idea we can measure this. But measurement's great, but you only measure in order to inform decisions. And so you want to be cognizant of what those decisions are or might be.
Is that one of the 6-step program to move from qualitative to quantitative?
Yeah, it should be. It absolutely should be.
Okay, let's move on to another topic that I've seen, and I've had the challenge myself as a CISO. We started applying FAIR to all the risks, to go through a risk register, and instead of having a colored risk register, we have numbers, financial impact. We have our vendor ecosystem. We do the same thing with that. So now we have, all these risks, these different attack vectors, but we have all these numbers. And is that a risk picture? How do we talk about that? Do we just add them all up and say it's $200 million, or what's the best approach to that?
Yeah, well, aggregation is a non-trivial activity. It is really tempting, and again, this is something I failed at in the early days of developing and applying FAIR. I just added the numbers up, and you just can't do that because there are probabilities around these things. In some cases, there are correlations. So aggregation is something you want to be very careful about. My recommendation in many cases is not to aggregate, but instead to take maybe the top 3, 5, whatever the case might be, loss event scenarios, those that represent the most risk to the organization, and report those individually. Don't even aggregate those 3 or 5. but just report on those, because in my experience, very often, the top handful of loss event scenarios that an organization faces represents, 90+% of their overall exposure, right? There is this, tends to be this very steep drop off in exposure after, the first few loss event scenarios that are big and make up, the majority of what an organization faces. So focusing there is much simpler, and I think avoids some potentially very challenging conversations, especially when you're dealing with business executives, many of whom are quantitatively inclined, right? They're backgrounds in sales or marketing or operations or those sorts of things that have been quantifying stuff for a long time, and are more than happy in some cases to start looking under rocks and digging and poking and prodding and that sort of thing. So you want to avoid opportunities to make missteps, and aggregation is one of those key opportunities to misstep. So my recommendation is, unless you really know what you're doing, avoid aggregation.
Makes sense. So, as I talked to a lot of CISOs and different folks who have adopted FAIR, they really embrace it. But I occasionally see challenges that to me you're supposed to be able to connect it to return on investment, the old term, but the cost benefit of what we're talking about with risk. When you're presenting, to executives or to a business unit, what's your best process for doing that?
Well, it can be relatively simple, right? You have let's say, a current state assessment. Here's how much risk we have right now. Maybe it's from, an outage of key business systems due to ransomware that came in through phishing. Maybe that's the loss event scenario. And you've done an analysis and you said, here's how much risk we have today. But if we added this new technology or improved this process or whatever the case might be, here's how much less risk we'll have. And so that's sort of the value proposition of the change in controls or the investments. And you want to include, when you're talking about that, you want to include sort of the capital investment and the operational costs, right? If they exist. Don't always have capital costs, but almost always have operational costs, ongoing operational costs. And so very often I recommend that people analyze the first year where you probably have the heaviest investment and represent that separately from sort of ongoing costs and reduction in risk, and splitting it into sort of those two dimensions, because I think it's provides more clarity and sets better expectations, so it can be as simple as that. You can also get into challenges associated with, well, let's say an organization wants to make an investment in endpoint detection and response, EDR systems, right? Well, EDR as a control applies to more than just one loss event scenario, right? So you might, in some cases, want to analyze its effect on multiple scenarios, and then that gives you a more complete picture of its value proposition. Again, I wouldn't go crazy with it. I would focus on maybe the top 2 or 3 scenarios in which it's relevant, so that you're not spending all day analyzing. You can actually do stuff. But yeah, that I think sums it up.
Good advice. So, a lot of folks I talk to, uh, it is a challenge when they're introducing FAIR into their reporting. But from your perspective, can you give me a script for a 60-second narrative that a CISO can use when he's opening up the presentation before he gets into the actual meat of
Yes, I don't know how smoothly this will roll off my tongue, but I can give you, um, I give it a shot. So, I would begin and have, in fact, done this, begin by saying, essentially, here's how we've been doing it, qualitatively and whatnot. Here's the kind of information we've been giving you. And we're pivoting to a more quantitative measurement and reporting practice or discipline. And here's why, right? Here are the advantages. Here are the challenges, right? But the advantages are, better prioritization, an ability to do cost-benefit analysis, which you can't do with qualitative measurements. There's no such thing as an ROI report for qualitative measurements. Some people will say, well, we went from red to yellow. Okay, well, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, the ROI is green.
And the ROI is green or purple or chartreuse or whatever. So it's, I present, here's how we've been doing it and the limitations with that. Here's what we plan to do. And when you move to something like quantitative, especially when you're dealing with executives, many of whom are, have a background in quantitative analysis and of some sort, if only through their MBA or something like that, right? Be prepared to answer questions about how you're doing it. What data are you using? What model are you applying? These sorts of things, because you want to set their minds at ease. Unfortunately, quantitative analysis in the cybersecurity space has had a checkered past. Particularly in the 90s, there were attempts to do it that just fell flat. I mean, just didn't stand up, didn't make sense, and which drove many within the profession, most within the profession, to conclude that you can't quantify cyber risk. Well, fortunately, they were wrong. It's just that the approaches, that had been taken hadn't been really well thought through. And so you want to be prepared to answer questions about the model you're using. Now, it might be something like FAIR, that's an open, well-documented model. It's not a black box. It's not opaque in some fashion. And the data you're applying. And sometimes your data are going to be robust, and sometimes the data is going to be sparse, and you're going to be relying on what we refer to as calibrated subject matter expertise. So, as I've rambled through this answer that's taken way more than 60 seconds, right? I guess I would try to boil it down to being clear about the distinction between previous state and future state from your measurement approaches. Be prepared to explain the model, the data, and if you're using something referred to as stochastic methods or Monte Carlo methods under the covers, those sorts of things. Many executives, again, especially if they have an MBA, will be familiar with things like stochastic or Monte Carlo methods, and they'll go, oh, well, I know that works. So you want to set their minds at ease in that regard. And so I'll stop rambling there and we can flesh that out if you have sort of further questions on
I would wrap that up by saying if you really want to be good at it, go out and get Jack's book and read it first.
that. Well, that's a start. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jack.
Mm-hmm.